Coming up, breaking down the outcomes of the COP26 climate summit. Lycia Maddocks tells us more. Plus, changing up congressional districts. How could redistricting harm or help tribal communities? We'll hear from Holly Cook Macarro. I'm Mark Trahant. Join us for those headlines, plus interviews from Indian Country Today.
The Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication at Arizona State University is honored to be a supporter of Indian Country Today. Working with award-winning professors, Cronkite students learn news reporting, social media, shooting and editing videos, and producing content for communications industries. Cronkite's 15 professional programs give students the opportunity to cover critical issues throughout the U.S. and beyond. Learn more at cronkite.asu.edu.
This is Indian Country Today.
Thank you for joining us. I'm Mark Trahant. Tuesday marked the second and final day of the virtual White House Tribal Nations Summit. Vice President Kamala Harris closed out the gathering.
In this pivotal moment, we have an opportunity to build a better future, not just for this generation, but for the 7 generations to come. So thank you all for joining the inaugural White House Tribal Nations Summit of the Biden-Harris administration. Thank you for your commitment to building a strong nation-to-nation relationship with our administration. And please know that President Joe Biden and I are committed to being a strong partner with you. We believe that together we can build a better future.
The Vice President called for the protection of voting rights and increased access to broadband. Tuesday's program consisted of 4 panels and 1 listening session with Interior Secretary Deb Haaland. Tribal leaders participating in the summit said they want to be consulted on all matters regarding their nations, and they want to continue to have access to federal officials. White House Climate Advisor Gina McCarthy said their requests are being heard.
President Biden has told each and every one of us repeatedly and in no uncertain terms that tribal nations are partners. We are to respect you and develop these relationships, and that you will not be the last to be considered, but rather the first. Thank you.
The White House promised a summit for the next 3 years. An Indigenous woman is making history by being the first Native judge to sit on the second highest court in Minnesota. Last week, Meskwaki citizen Sarah Wheelock was appointed to the state's Court of Appeals by Governor Tim Walz and Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan. Flanagan says Wheelock's extensive legal background provides her with unique perspective that will be invaluable in her new position. She has worked as a professor at Mitchell-Hamline College of Law and as an appellate judge for the Whiter Band of Chippewa Court of Appeals. Wheelock is currently legal counsel for the Shakopee Mdewakanten Sioux community. Her legal experience includes litigation in tribal, federal, and state courts, as well as finance and economic development. In 2016, White Earth Ojibwe citizen Anne McCaig became the first Native person to sit on the state's Supreme Court. For the first time ever, treaties with the U.S. and tribal nations will be publicly available and searchable. The Department of Agriculture and the Interior have contracted with Oklahoma State University to develop a tribal treaty database. This will allow people to search through the treaties. The first phase of the project will digitize treaties compiled by Charles Kapler, the former clerk of the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs. And the university has hired Indian law experts to advise on the indexing process. Both the digitized treaties and the indexing in the database will be expandable for future phases. A beta version of the database launched this week at the White House Tribal Nations Summit. The names of 87 Native students who died at a Nebraska boarding school have been found. Researchers at the Genoa Indian School used a ground-penetrating radar to search in cemeteries. Margaret Jacobs is co-director of the Genoa Indian School Digital Reconciliation Project. She says it's heartbreaking how the leadership handled the children's deaths.
A lot of children got very sick at the schools, and the administrators knew that the children were going to die, and they didn't want that recorded on their watch, so they sent the children home. So, for example, one of the reports I read recently talked about we only had one death this year, but there were 23 children who were incurable with tuberculosis, and we sent them home.
The Genoa Indian School was one of the largest in a system of 25 federally run boarding schools for Native children. Leaders from the Genoa Indian School Digital Reconciliation Project say some names identified might be duplicates, but the true death toll is likely much higher. An Indigenous actress is hitting the big screen with help from Marvel Studios and Disney+. Lycia Cox will star in the upcoming Marvel series Echo, which focuses on the comic book superhero that was announced on Disney+ Day. The series will be a spin-off of the original series Hawkeye, where the character Echo will be introduced in an upcoming episode. The Echo character is best known as a supporting character in the Daredevil universe, which appeared in Marvel Comics in 1999. She is usually seen with a white handprint over her face, which symbolizes her father's murder. Lycia Cox also has a prosthetic leg. The character's real name is Maya Lopez. She is deaf, just like the real actress who will be playing her. And those are the headlines for Indian Country Today. I'm Mark Trahant. Coming up, Lycia Maddocks tells us the details from the climate actions that came from COP26. Stay tuned. There is no climate justice without Indigenous rights. That's the statement Indigenous leaders made at last week's climate change conference. The COP26 Climate Summit brought together the world's leaders to address the Earth's rising temperatures. At the conversation in Glasgow, Scotland, was Lycia Maddocks. She is the political director at NDN Collective and joins us now. Welcome, Lycia.
Hey, Kamada Venti. It's good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Let's start by kind of setting the scene. I mean, there were so many levels going on. Give us the experience.
Sure. So we definitely, prior to landing in Scotland, were really just going with a big understanding that we had a lot of responsibility on our shoulders. While this was billed as one of the most inclusive COPs, Indigenous people did not have that experience. So I'm sure that you all have reported several times on how COVID has exacerbated a lot of issues in Indigenous communities. And it's like that across the globe. And so on top of COVID and other financial restrictions, it was really difficult for Indigenous people to truly be at this table at one of the most important climate conversations in our lifetime. And so we went with demands in hand. NDN Collective's climate justice team launched their campaign this past summer, and part of their campaign includes making sure that globally, we are not allowing false solutions. And what that means is that we don't want any climate projects, regardless of how they're built in terms of nature-based solutions, to mean that Indigenous communities continue to suffer through extractive industries that happen in their territories, through the carbon calculators that don't really exist right now, and other types of things that would make it so that extractive industries are still able to operate at their current levels. And we really don't see a ton of change in terms of climate solutions. And so we arrived a couple days early. We were able to sit in the local communities of Indigenous Peoples Platform, LSIP for short. They have a facilitative working group. And what this group is, it's the legal mechanism for Indigenous people to be able to have their voice elevated at the global level within the United Nations climate within the United Nations climate mechanism. So what we learned was that Indigenous people across the globe are all asking for the same thing. We're all asking to make sure that Indigenous knowledge is taken into account in any type of climate solutions. We're all asking that any funding that is committed to climate adaptation and mitigation, it actually reaches Indigenous communities, frontline communities for that matter, because we all know how tied up in red tape that all of the funding can take. And so what we asked was that these the deliveries, the implementation of all of these strategies are actually taken into account. And we also we're asking for an independent grievance mechanism. So if bad climate actors were actually able to complete projects or initiate projects, we wanted a mechanism where we were able to voice our concerns to the supervisory body and to truly be able to see outcomes. And we also wanted an independent funding mechanism. We wanted to make sure that climate solutions were funded in a good way, and that it would truly meet the needs of the developing communities that needed it the most. And so we had a lot to set the tone with, and what we saw was a lot of solidarity going into this. NDN Collective was able to assist in drafting the opening statements that we made in front of the COP presidency that outlined the 7 demands that we had, and they meant including traditional ecological knowledge. Native people, Indigenous people were the first scientists of this world. So we demanded that our knowledge be taken into account. We also demanded that gender and persons with disabilities and human rights be included in all of the language across the decision documents that came out of this. We demanded, true solutions. We asked for an end to the fossil fuel and extractive industries. And so we watched all of that play out throughout the time that we were there. We were there for 20 days. So it was a big deal for us.
How much progress do you think was made on those goals that you just outlined?
Sure. So we had 7 demands, and out of the 7 demands, we had 4 of those demands met. We were able to get human rights, persons with disabilities, traditional ecological knowledge, all included in all of the final decision documents. So there were some areas of progress, and there were also some areas where we were seeing states not budge. And all the way through some of the later negotiations, we saw that some of the wealthier countries did not want to come up with some funding solutions for developing countries who were experiencing some of the highest climate change issues. And for example, the United States is one of the biggest polluters, and we needed to be able to commit funding to those states, to those countries that were highly affected by what we've done through our processes and our industries. So that all the way to the last conversations that ended at past 11 p.m. on Saturday night, one day later than the conference was supposed to end, we're all still being highly discussed and debated.
In the intro, I mentioned, or the first question, I mentioned different levels of concern. But one is that governments seem to be wanting to take baby steps when there's a need to increase the velocity of change. How does that message get out to the broader community?
Sure. So that's definitely what we saw. And I don't think that's anything new. We know that government tends to move slowly. And what we heard by former President Barack Obama was that communities were what kept the climate fight alive, especially after we saw our 45th president pull out of the Paris Agreement. And so we made sure that through internal and external conversations that we were laying out what was at stake. And we did see a lot of progress in that regard. We were able to meet with senior climate officials like Gina McCarthy and the special envoy that's run by John Kerry. And these messages truly got out. You heard that in a majority of the states' statements during the conversations to debate cover decisions. And so we know that all of this is out in the open, but what we're trying to see now is that that these things are funded, and that they're implemented, and that we push for more aggressive timelines. And that's all really going to happen at home. So a lot of people have asked, how's it going? You know, how do you feel like this conference went? Well, the real work happens at home. And so our Indigenous platform has committed to doubling down on all of our narrative efforts and all of our conversations with government officials across the globe in the countries where we live. And so we just intend on continuing to push our 7 demands and make sure that from the conception all the way to implementation, Indigenous voices are at the table and that we're seeing true outcomes.
Is one way to elevate that conversation at home to put into practice best practices?
Yes, absolutely. And part of that means having Indigenous stakeholders at the table. What we've seen through the Line 3 projects and the Dakota Access Pipeline projects, Chaco Canyon, all of the sacred sites and land issues, land, water, and air issues that we face at home, we see that all of these decisions are happening on governmental levels, but don't necessarily take into account traditional ecological knowledge. And a lot of politicians don't even really know what that means and how to incorporate that. But that means that you hand that over to the Indigenous people and allow us to collaborate and put our bright minds together. NCAI's president, Fawn Sharp, was appointed to the U.S. delegation. I had several conversations with her over the course of time, and she is committed to ensuring that the member tribes of NCAI are also having discussions in their task force meetings. It's a very powerful body. And then on the local level, NDN Collective answers to communities. And so we want to make sure that we're having these key conversations in climate groups from the grassroots level as well.
We only have about a minute left, but I want to ask you about the power of networks. 20 years ago, when a UN meeting would come together, Native groups would get together and then they'd go home and that'd be it. You're now connected in a way that is really powerful. I'm interested in hearing your take on that.
Sure. So I feel like that was one of the most powerful outcomes. We were able to sit with Indigenous people from across the globe. And I have to tell you that all of those powerful minds, all of that culture, all of that prayer, all of that healing that we did together, there are no words for that. But what we did voice was our commitment to ensuring that we're staying involved with the LSIP, and we're also making sure to stay highly involved with watching how implementation plays out, and also making sure that we're holding accountable any of these decisions that came out. So we have a tight-knit body. We're pushing out all the memes in our Signal chats here just to kind of keep things light but real. And yes, so we are connected. Not only were we able to make good relationships in person, but due to technology, we're able to keep that up after the Conference of Parties. So we really look forward to collaborating and making sure to elevate our 3-year work plan and just be ready to go back to the table for COP27.
Lycia Maddocks, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Up next, looking at the news coming from the White House Tribal Nations Summit and redrawing congressional district lines. What does that mean for some tribal nations? We'll be right back. It's only Wednesday, and you would be amazed at how much news is coming out of Washington, D.C. this week. The White House Tribal Nations Summit. And here, as usual, to help us sort through the news is Holly Cook Macarro. She's a partner with Spirit Rock Consulting and is a regular contributor to our news program. Welcome, Holly.
Hi, Mark. It's good to see you.
Before we get to the White House Summit, let's talk really quickly about redistricting. The process is closing really fast, and so this is the moment when people have to comment and say this is right or wrong.
Yes, and we are at that point in many states where, redistricting sometimes doesn't seem as if it is going to have a huge effect on us. But for many tribes across the country who are watching this, there are effects in Montana, opportunities and effects. Let's say that. In Montana, there are big changes coming for tribes in California. We've got Arizona with huge impacts on tribal representation there as well. And tribal governments, even individuals, have opportunities to weigh in over the next month. We have some states that are final. Some of these have issued draft. For instance, in California, they've issued draft maps. Now we've got open for comment for about 5 weeks, and they will issue a final map on December 27th. That will give us the lay of the land for what these huge midterm elections, where control of both chambers of the Congress are going to be in play. That is going to give us the lay of the land for what the next few months are going to look like in terms of campaigns and candidates.
Well, and the big thing is you start a campaign in a hole or with on a mound, depending on how these districts are drawn.
Exactly. So when you look at a state like Montana, which has a very significant number of Native Americans as a percentage of the population, and this is really a sea change for, there are a few states that have long had just one representative given their overall low population. It's usually a little over 700,000 that make up one congressional district, and but now Montana will have two. That's huge. So we've got kind of a smaller eastern district, or a smaller western district, a larger eastern district. They've effectively split up the tribes in the state. We are hoping to see potentially some Native candidates who I know are thinking about it right now step up into those seats. In Arizona, powerhouse Native American voting state. We saw that in the presidential election in 2020. Powerhouse, both in political activism on the state side and the national side, but also in their, I think their voice in the state on in voting on these. And so in these districts, the map that has been put out in Arizona could split up some of these very, very politically impactful tribes, both in the size of their vote and in the power of their political voices. So that's not a mistake. And I think we see that more and more as Native political power continues to grow, continues to evolve. The sophistication is there, and people are noticing. There are efforts. When we look at Sharice Davids, there's been a very public. No one was hiding their cards there. They're trying to redistrict Sharice Davids out of her seat in the state of Kansas. Now, I didn't see the focus quite so much on the tribes, given the huge population in the state of California, but certainly in the efforts in the South to potentially put all of the tribes into one district, where that would cover maybe Inland Valley South down to the San Diego Mexico line. That would be impactful. And I always think that tribes benefit. The more voices and advocates that we have representing tribes is to our benefit.
Well, and if we just did it based on population, there should be roughly 18 members of Congress, not just 5. I want to shift to Washington and to the White House Tribal Summit. What's your takeaway from that?
It was hard to keep up. And I know all the announcements, it seemed as if from the president on down, the president, Secretary Holland, Secretary Becerra, the Attorney General, we kept seeing, an announcement in regards, and these are huge announcements. The president went through, I've got 5 announcements. It was respecting treaty rights, a huge and critical joint secretarial order on promoting and strengthening co-management of federal lands with tribes. Those are important opportunities for tribes to regain control of ancestral homelands. All of these are meaningful. And as we discussed a few months ago, when the Tribal Nations Summit was announced about, well, why is that important? We saw why it's important, because it forces every single agency to look around, to answer the White House. What are you doing for Indian country? What are you bringing to the table? What can we do? What is the input that you've heard from tribal leaders? And I think this administration has been extraordinary in getting that input. There's been, because of the CARES Act, we've seen, because of the pandemic, the CARES Act, ARPA, we've seen extraordinary responsiveness and engagement from the Department of Treasury because they were charged with distributing those funds. The learning curve and what they now know about Indian country is at a level we've never seen before. And this Tribal Nation Summit right now, when really shifting sands, because both in the economy and in healthcare, on what tribal leaders are looking at, huge announcements that are going to make a difference as we move into the next year.
We only have 30 seconds left, but one of the phrases that struck me was when the president said more than 50 appointments in this government of Native people.
Yes, those are critical. You know, we usually say, who's the Assistant Secretary of Indian Affairs or who is the IHS Director, but notably lacking, by the way. But beyond that, we have folks at the Bureau of Land Management. We have General Counsel for the United States Department of Agriculture. We have the Solicitor at the Department of Interior. We have very knowledgeable staff at the Department of Treasury. We have these political appointments throughout the administration. This, I think, is an unprecedented level of not just the Native slots, but Native Americans who are making a difference within this administration in non-traditional spots, where we definitely are seeing their work this week.
Thank you, Holly Cook Macarro.
Yes, thank you, Mark.
And that's a slice of our Indigenous world. Thank you for watching. For all the latest news, go to IndianCountryToday.com. I'm Mark Trahan.
Sometimes you got to take a stand just because you know you can. Oh, you got to run, you got to run. Standing Rock. This is Indian Country Today.